On December 15th, a majority of the NBA becomes trade eligible, and I wanted to preface December 15th and specifically the trade season in the NBA with this video here today as we discuss every single NBA trade exception across the entire NBA. All 30 NBA teams. We're going to talk about every single trade exception that presently exists. We're going to talk about how they work. It's going to be a very good video for those who need to learn more about the trade exceptions, how they work, who has them, who doesn't, and how we could potentially see them function this trade deadline. If you guys are new to utility sports, first of all, leave a like on today's video, and then secondly, make sure to subscribe for more content. This video is going to be a bit longer. It's going to be very technical. There's a lot of small, intricate details that will be important in this one. So if you do have any questions, if there's something you're not exactly certain about, feel free to leave your questions down in the comment section below. Not only do I read every single comment, I'm there to help, but I'm also sure other people will be in the comment section able to help you out as well. So without further ado, let's jump into it here now with our video preview. Again, we're going to talk about every single NBA trade exception. We're going to look at expiration dates for those NBA trade exceptions. We're also going to look at the new cap aprons. Remember, the first and second apron. We're going to look at how that will impact the trade deadline this season and how it's going to impact some of these trade exceptions specifically. We're going to also consider some potential trade targets for specific teams, for specific trade exception numbers as well. So keep that in mind here too. And then also, as we go throughout this, I might even talk about a trade exception for a trade exception. That's a very nuanced discussion, but one that I do think, especially with how the new aprons work, is actually one of the most important tidbits of information that I haven't seen anyone else talk about so far. So let's jump into it here now with what is a trade exception. Again, this is the beginning level for people who really aren't sure exactly what this is. Teams can create trade exceptions by sending out more salary than they take back through a singular trade. Essentially, if you traded an $8 million player for a $4 million player, you would create a $4 million trade exception. And the reason that this exists is to give extra flexibility to teams to make trades, to encourage trades. The NBA clearly likes the way that the trade market draws interest, and obviously a lot of talking discussion on mainstream media, television, all that kind of stuff. So they want to encourage trades, and they want to give teams extra added flexibility. If you trade away a player making $20 million and you only replace him with a $12 million player, the NBA wants to give you kind of almost a credit, an $8 million credit of, hey, you traded out $20 million, you didn't take $20 million back in. Here's that extra wiggle room you sacrificed. You can now bring that wiggle room back in with another player. Now, it's also important to note that these trade exceptions can theoretically be split into multiple uses. For example, if you have a $13 million trade exception, you could technically use that twice, 3 times, maybe even 4 times if you split it up enough. In this example here, you could use it to, say, acquire a $5 million player in one trade, and then you could later go back out into the marketplace, make a second trade, having split up that trade exception, $5 million for the first part, and then you can also split it into an $8 million trade exception later. So that's important to note as well. This can be used over the normal salary cap. So even if your team is past the normal salary cap, you can use a trade exception to add more salary onto your books. Now, there are some things you cannot do. You cannot combine a trade exception with another salary. So if you have a $20 million player and a $20 million trade exception, you cannot combine those two things to get a $40 million player. That is not how this works. So keep that in mind here. You also cannot combine it with other trade exceptions. So let's say you have a $10 million trade exception and a $20 million trade exception. You cannot combine those two things to have a $30 million trade exception. Again, that's very important to know. You also cannot use these trade exceptions to propel your team past a hard cap position. So a lot of teams right now in the NBA are hard capped at the first apron. Some of them are hard capped at the second apron. If you are hard capped, you cannot use a trade exception to go past the amount you're hard capped at. So for a team like, say, my favorite team, the Dallas Mavericks, they are hard capped at the first apron. They cannot use their current trade exceptions to go past that first apron number, even though their trade exceptions are quite large, which we'll get to here pretty soon. Now that we have the background, let's get into some notes. If you see an asterisk next to a team's name, that denotes that the team is hard capped at the first apron, which is roughly $178.2 million. If you see an up caret next to a team's name, that denotes that the team is hard capped at the second apron, which is roughly $189 million of total team spending. Important note, make sure you guys keep that in mind. Here are some insignificant exceptions. These are exceptions that I think are just flat out too small to actually be used in any real capacity. The Celtics, Pacers, Hornets, and Kings all have exceptions that are sub $1 million. And notice here the Kings with an asterisk means that they are hard capped at the first apron. The Pacers with an up caret are hard capped at the second apron. Keep that in mind. There's the expiration dates as well. These are insignificant exceptions though. Now let's jump into some smaller exceptions. And these are exceptions I could see being used for players making the minimum. A few guys on maybe two-way contracts. Now it's very unlikely we see a majority of these actually get used. Keep that in mind here, but the Raptors do have two at the top. Remember, they cannot combine these two exceptions. They cannot combine these for roughly $3 million dollars. They cannot do that. So keep that in mind here. The Bucks have $2 million trade exceptions. Now that's an important number for them. Maybe they could go out and use that if they find players sub $2 million. The Grizzlies have 2. Remember, they cannot combine those. The Warriors have 1. The Nets have a couple. Now, the interesting thing with the Brooklyn Nets, they have about $6 million in room, I believe, until they get to that first apron number where they are hard capped at, again, denoted by that asterisk. The Celtics have a trade exception. The Bulls have a trade exception. They have room to take in that salary. The Hawks also have a trade exception. Theirs is a little bit bigger, $3.713 million, which leads us into some of our mid-sized exceptions. And this is where we get to see some bigger trade exceptions. These are the ones that are going to be a little bit more functional. We're also going to get into some players that I think could make some sense as well to see in some of these mid-sized exception numbers. The New York Knicks have 2 of these mid-sized exceptions, but remember, they cannot combine them together, and they're also a very great example of how the hard cap is going to affect them in this type of situation. Even though they have 2 pretty solidly sized exceptions, $3.873 million, $5.241 million, they have the room to add in players through these exceptions. The only issue is they don't have room between where their current state is and the actual second apron hard cap after all of their trades, specifically the one involving Karl Anthony Towns. It put them right up to that second apron number. They only have about $500,000 of room, which means if they were to even try and use these exceptions in any way, they would actually have to go out into the marketplace, dump some salary first. They do have Mitchell Robinson as a player who could theoretically be moved, right? Not sure if he actually will be or not, and I'm not saying he will or should or will be, but just keep that in mind. They have flexibility. They have ways to maybe open up room to use these trade exceptions if they want to, but it would come at the cost of trading other salary out the door. So that's super important. With that $0.58 million of room, it's very obvious they don't really have a functional way of using these mid-level size exceptions at this point in time. The Washington Wizards, they do have room. This is about $3.5 million here that they could theoretically go out and take in a salary. The Wizards have a couple of trade exceptions. We'll talk about them at length a little bit more later on. The Toronto Raptors have a $5.107 million trade exception. This stems from part of their Pascal Siakam trade to the Pacers. Notice this expires January 17th, 2025, so a couple of weeks actually before the NBA trade deadline here in 2025. So if Toronto does want to get involved and use this exception, they're going to have to do so before the actual trade deadline. The Pelicans have a $5.722 million trade exception. They only have about $3.806 million of room. Keep that in mind as well. Very important to note that they don't have room for the entire $5.72 million. They are also down in the bottom right with a $9.9 million trade exception. Again, only have about $3.81 million of room. So it's not like they're going to be able to go out into the marketplace and use the entirety of these exceptions. The first one comes from the Kyra Lewis Jr. salary dump. The second is a result of signing and trading Jonas Valanciunas to Washington in the offseason. And you'll notice that one expires July 6, 2025 because of the date of the initial transaction being obviously at the start of the new league year in the 2024 offseason. The Miami Heat have a trade exception, $6.447 million, but as you can note, again, only about $1.21 million of room before they would be ultimately hard capped at the second apron, so they don't have a lot of flexibility either. Their deal also, their exception also expires before the trade deadline, January 23rd. The Jazz have 2 trade exceptions, and I think the Jazz could be very, very active. They have a ton of flexibility, a ton of room. They also have some interesting players who teams theoretically could want out in the marketplace this year, like Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson, to name a couple. John Collins is another interesting name to watch. The Jazz, theoretically, if they were to use these exceptions, it would probably be to take in salaries from other teams. Now remember, not every team is going to use an exception in the same way another one would. Some teams might use trade exceptions to try and add talent to their roster, and it might cost them a good player or a draft pick in return, whereas some other teams would maybe try to prefer using an exception to take in a undesirable contract and maybe get second round draft pick compensation, maybe even a first round draft pick compensation, just depending on the size and length of the contract that they are acquiring. Moving on to the right side of the graphic here now, the Timberwolves. They have 2 trade exceptions here. I don't expect them to use it given where their organization is currently at in terms of trying to shave some money off. They do have Julius Randle's expiring contract too. Minnesota would be an interesting dark horse deadline team if something were to go down. I'm just not exactly sure if something actually really will or not. The Dallas Mavericks, I think another great example here of how that first apron threshold is going to be a real challenge for some teams. The Mavericks are a hard cap based on some of their offseason moves at the first apron. They have this $4 million trade exception from when they traded Seth Curry last year to the Charlotte Hornets. That expires February 10th, 2025. So if you don't use it, you lose it, and the Mavericks are in a real position to potentially lose this trade exception. And it's because they can only take in about $500,000 right now. That's all they have for room under the first apron. So if the Mavs do make moves, they're going to have to move a lot of salary around. They do have some tradable contracts, but a majority of them are key rotational players. So Dallas is going to be an interesting team. Nico Harrison has made a move every single trade deadline while being the GM of the Dallas Mavericks. So will he continue that trend or not? We'll see. Dallas is typically one of the most active trade deadline teams. It's hard to imagine them not making some type of trade. I'm just not exactly sure what that move will be yet at this point in time. The Nets, we've talked about them as well. They only have about $5.22 million of room, but they do have a $9.5 million trade exception. And the Nets are a great example of how a team could maybe move some players to open up space. They have Dennis Schroeder, they have Dorian Finney-Smith, they have Cam Johnson. If they were to theoretically move those players, they could open up more room between them and the first apron, which would maybe allow them to use this $9.5 million as a way to take in contracts that other teams would want to, in a vacuum, maybe get rid of. The Kings have 2 trade exceptions. Now, noting that they only have about $5.9 million of room, it's more likely that we could see them either split up the first one, the $6.341 million trade exception, and use up $5.9 million of that one, or they could just flat out use the entirety of the second trade exception that expires on July 8th. So you might say, well, why would they use the first one if it's a bigger number when they could just use the second one and use it all? The reason for that would be, theoretically, if Sacramento wanted to maintain extra flexibility, the second trade exception expires 10 days after the first one. So if Sacramento wanted to use the first one to keep some of their flexibility open going into the offseason, that would make some sense potentially. The Warriors, just like Dallas, they don't really have a lot of room out of the first apron. They do have this trade exception after moving Klay Thompson this offseason, but there's really no way to actually functionally use it given where they're currently at now. They do have DeAnthony Melton's contract at around $12.5 million. If they do find a way to trade him or include him into a deal, they could open up some room against the first apron, and if they do that, then there's a way that they could open up avenues, open up possibilities to wiggle around and find ways to actually use the $7.3 million trade exception. The Pelicans, there's their $9.9 million one from the Valanciunas trade we talked about earlier. Again, they don't have really the room to use that, but you never know if Brandon Ingram gets moved. Maybe they can open up some of that flexibility. Remember, if you do have questions too, make sure to ask, because I'm kind of going through some of these pretty quickly. If you want to know about your favorite team specifically, just please let me know down in the comment section below. Again, I read every single comment. The Portland Trailblazers, a little bit under $7 million. This is another team that I think could be extremely active. They have players who I could see them wanting to move, specifically someone like DeAndre Ayton. They have players that other teams around the league might value. Jeremy Grant, Anthony Simons are a couple of examples who of players who I could see getting moved theoretically. So Portland, I think, could be a real hotbed team this trade deadline. They have the cap flexibility. They're not hard capped. They have about $7 million here in this trade exception, almost $6.875 million. Remember, you cannot exceed that number. You can go right up to that number, though. And that expires in July, so they have a lot of flexibility whether they use it in the trade deadline this year or in the upcoming offseason. That is yet to be seen. Here are some potential mid-sized trade targets, so you have been looking at the exceptions. What players could theoretically fit into these exceptions? And I have a couple of examples. Again, this is not every single player. There's a whole wide list of players that could make sense, but a few that come to mind for me. Jake LaRavia. He had his team option actually declined by the Grizzlies. I was kind of surprised by that. He has been playing pretty solid basketball for them, kind of fills a litany of different needs and roles and skills for them. He only makes about $3.5 million, a little bit less than that even. So he could fit into a bunch of these different trade exceptions for young teams like Washington, for some of these rebuilding teams, maybe like Brooklyn. LaRavia could make some sense as a very attainable, very cheap option. For a team like New Orleans, who has been really devastated by injuries this year, LaRavia also could make some sense there. And for Memphis, it would be about getting compensation. And this is one of the beautiful things about trade exceptions. Memphis wouldn't have to take salary back in to get a deal done technically if they wanted to operate that way. If the Grizzlies were looking to add an extra draft asset, maybe line up for another move down the road, centering around, say, Marcus Smart's contract in a future trade, that's maybe how Memphis could look to operate. I'm not, again, saying that they will, but it's just an option. Cam Whitmore could be a player I could see a ton of teams wanting to go get. Now, I don't think Houston's going to be doing anything to their young core of players. In fact, I think Cam Whitmore will certainly be in Houston after the trade deadline, but you never know. I wanted to include him as another example of a young player, and Brandon Podziemski is another great example of this. In the second year of his career, hasn't shot the ball nearly as well this season as he did as a rookie. I think that will revert back to normal in the near future. He's making about $3.5 million. So if Golden State is active, if they do decide to make a bigger splash trade, we've heard Jimmy Butler's name as a reported potential target for the Golden State Warriors. Maybe Podziemski becomes an attainable player, and with how small his contract is, he fits into a ton of these trade exceptions, and that's the value of trade exceptions, right? You can fit players into those without worrying about having to have a perfect salary to go back out the door to match in a potential deal. Kevin Love, a veteran. If Miami does move off of Jimmy Butler, who we just talked about, Kevin Love could be a valuable veteran to add for a variety of teams. A bunch of teams in the West looking to add a little bit more size to maybe try and deal with Nikola Jokic, especially with how Minnesota handled him last year with two big men. Kevin Love could maybe be a rotational big to fit into the mix. Kobe Buffkin, another former first-round pick, kind of fits into the same ideology as Cam Whitmore, Brandon Podziemski, although Buffkin hasn't had quite the opportunity of those two guys in some ways, and hasn't played nearly as well as them either in certain stretches either, but $4.3 million definitely could fit into some of these trade exceptions. Malik Beasley, another player who makes a ton of sense, $6 million this year. Detroit, I could see them being a seller at the deadline. Now, I do think that they've liked how the shooters have performed for them, especially around Cade Cunningham, but I do think Beasley could be a movable asset for sure. Jalen Smith, $8.571 million. He's one of the more sneaky options, sneaky candidates on this list. Chicago is going to be a team that entertains selling at the deadline. Zach LaVine's been having a fantastic season. I'm not really shocked by that. I think he's become a heavily underrated player just because of how big his contract is. Nikola Vucevic has been shooting the ball extremely well from three this season and has had a surprisingly good year as well. Jalen Smith, though, in the heart of the Bulls fire sale, maybe he could be a player with that contract being very movable, very attainable into some of these trade exceptions. He could be a candidate. Gary Payton II, just like how we talked about with Podziemski for the Warriors, if Golden State's making moves, if they center something around DeAnthony Melton, if they center something around GP2, it could make some sense to open up ways and avenues for them to utilize that $7.3 million trade exception. Luke Kennard, again, like we talked about with Memphis, if they're trying to find ways to open up future avenues, trading Luke Kennard could make some sense in potentially trading him to another team with a trade exception. And Memphis's long-term plan would be to open up that trade exception back. If Memphis were to trade Kennard out and not take back any salary, they would open their own trade exception. Remember, before the video, in the video preview, I talked about trade exceptions for trade exceptions. And what I essentially meant by that was if you trade a player solely into a trade exception without taking anyone back at all in any form of the deal, you will open up your own trade exception for the contract size of that player. So if Memphis trades Luke Kennard for nobody, even though the Grizzlies are contending, I don't expect them to exactly do this. I think they're a great example of how they could open up extra flexibility by making some move like this and then pivoting and opening up future avenues for future decisions down the road. Jonas Valanciunas, very unlikely we see him moved into one of these mid-size areas, one of these mid-size exceptions, just because he makes $9.9 million. That was the biggest trade exception we've seen so far in this video. But the Lakers are a rumored destination for him, which we'll talk about maybe D'Angelo Russell here in just a minute. Moving on to some of these larger exceptions, the Memphis Grizzlies, look at that. We've talked about them a ton. On February 2nd, they have a $12.6 million trade exception, which expires, and that is from when they traded Steven Adams to the Houston Rockets into a trade exception. This is, again, another example of how Memphis kind of punted their season a little bit last year. They were so banged up, so injured, that they decided, hey, we can move Steven Adams, we can afford to get off of his salary here, open up extra flexibility. That $12.6 million is a theoretical option for them to use out in the trade market for a variety of different players. The Wizards as well. This one I think is super important. Keep your eyes on the Washington Wizards. I told you we would talk about them again later. They have this $12.4 million trade exception, which expires right after the NBA trade deadline. It's use it or lose it for Washington. And with the Wizards being in asset accumulation mode, I could see a team giving them an undesirable contract, giving them a bad contract to open up flexibility and to give up a couple of second-round picks to Washington. And while the Wizards aren't going to be better now because of this type of move, they might be better down the road. And getting extra draft picks, using one of your trade exceptions that is, again, use it or lose it, I could see Washington absorbing a contract or two here at the deadline to help other teams out, improve your GM to GM relations, while also benefiting your own draft capital and draft assets that you have working with down the road. The Mavericks, they have a $16 million trade exception after trading away Tim Hardaway Jr. in the offseason, part of opening up the space a little bit as well for Klay Thompson to fit under that first apron. The Mavericks had a very, very strong offseason in terms of how they manipulated the cap, how they worked around certain salaries. It was a really good offseason, really productive offseason in my opinion for Nico Harrison. And the Mavericks are in a better spot because of it now. They've been playing pretty good basketball this season. The issue here, though, is they can't really use this trade exception unless something else moves, and unless there's some other type of move. They only have about $500,000 in room before that first apron hard cap, like we've already talked about. The Nets, this is a significant trade exception. This is something I need to talk about with both Brooklyn, Dallas, Atlanta, and Chicago here. These next four exceptions, they all expire in July, after the start of the new league year. And that's really important because these are not use it or lose it this trade deadline. Dallas, a team that, look, they don't really have the ability to move around and find ways out of that first apron hard cap like I've talked about. So saving that for this offseason, maybe saving it for the NBA draft, saving it for when a couple of contracts are maybe off their books or looking a little bit different, that's when Dallas has a little bit more flexibility. The Nets are in that kind of same boat. They only have about $5.2 million in room before the first apron hard cap. Well, the nice thing is if you're Brooklyn, you just sit on this trade exception from trading Mikal Bridges. You sit with this $23.3 million and you wait until you can use it in the offseason, probably as your nearest convenience. The Hawks and Bulls both have large trade exceptions as well. The Atlanta Hawks have a $25 million trade exception from trading DeJounte Murray away. This again expires July 7th of 2025. Very similar to the Brooklyn Nets, only about $5.2 million in room before the first apron hard cap. Don't expect them to really use it this trade deadline. Now, it's possible that, again, these teams could split it up. They could take in about $5 million here, get to a spot where they're right below that first apron, get to a comfortable spot this season, and still keep, $18 to $20 million going into future negotiations as you split up this trade exception. The Chicago Bulls, $17.5 million. This is from trading DeMar DeRozan to Sacramento, part of a 3-team trade in the offseason. They opened up this exception. This expires July 8th, and this could be a really nice tool for them going forward to add talent. They have about $9.5 million in room right now. Depending on how their fire sale goes, I could see Chicago opening up a ton of flexibility, both for this offseason and for future trade discussions. This $17.5 million trade exception is one of the crown jewel exceptions in the NBA right now, given where Chicago is at. And I wouldn't be shocked to see Chicago at some point in time use it. I just don't really expect it to be this trade deadline. If it is this trade deadline, they're only going to be able to use a fragment of it anyway, which could still be beneficial for them long term, but I'm not exactly certain that they're going to be extremely active with this specific trade exception. I think they'll be very active with Vucevic. They'll be very active in discussions around Levine. I just don't think this trade exception is going to be the crown jewel for them this trade deadline. I think it'll be more important, more impactful going into this upcoming NBA offseason. There's also some potential large trade targets that we need to talk about. And I don't just mean large trade targets in terms of great players. I want to talk about some players I could see being salary dumped. PJ Tucker is at the top of this list for a reason. Remember, the Washington Wizards have a $12.4 million trade exception. Well, guess what? The Clippers would love to salary dump PJ Tucker somewhere. The Wizards would likely buy out PJ Tucker immediately upon arrival. The Clippers would give up 1 or 2 second-round picks to Washington to get off of PJ Tucker. And what that would allow LA to do, they would take this $11.5 million trade exception and they could go back out into the marketplace and acquire other players, other pieces. And that would be extremely valuable for them, a team that's trying to make a playoff push this year. Bobby Portis, another player I could see being in 2-team, 3-team deals where Milwaukee's trying to kind of finagle this $12.5 million salary into a better player, a player that best fits their current iteration of Bucks basketball. Herb Jones is probably the best player that we've talked about in this video so far. $12.976 million. He is a tremendous player, a true first-team all-defense caliber player, one of the best wing defenders in the recent era of NBA basketball. And if New Orleans, who has had a really bad season, does end up selling on Herb Jones, he is going to be a highly coveted player by contenders, by rebuilding teams, by teams kind of in middle ground. Everyone and their mother will want Herb Jones. His salary is very small. He is under team control. He can guard multiple positions. He has a little bit of playmaking juice. He can shoot the ball relatively well. Herb Jones is going to be a highly coveted player this trade deadline if New Orleans does ultimately make him available. Dennis Schroeder, Dorian Finney-Smith. Again, I talked about Brooklyn earlier being a team to watch in terms of potential moves. Think about some of these other trade exceptions, some of these bigger numbers. $13 million, $14.9 million. If Brooklyn does become sellers, these are players that could fit into a couple of those trade exceptions. We've talked about Atlanta already as a team with a large trade exception. We talked about Chicago. I'm not sure if Chicago or Atlanta is really going to be buying on either of these two guys, but the numbers are very important, and especially when it comes to 3-team deals, these trade exceptions are super, super useful, so keep that in mind as well. Kevin Huerter is a potential salary dump, depending on how the Kings want to go. He's just not shooting the ball well again this season, which is really unfortunate for Sacramento. I think a lot of their team really hinged on Kevin Huerter being a flamethrower for them from 3. This year, he just has not been that, with a pretty hefty price tag at $16.83 million. Then D'Angelo Russell, very expensive for a backup guard. A little bit under $19 million. I could see the Lakers really utilizing his salary as a trade chip, and maybe some team is willing to take him in as an expiring contract. So what you're noticing here is a lot of expiring contracts, a lot of players who I think are at best role players. And like I said, Herb Jones, the best player we've really talked about at length in this video. He's going to be the most impactful player that could potentially get moved outside of maybe like a Jimmy Butler. And I'm not even sure if, long term, I don't know if Jimmy, given his age and injury history, would be quite the get that Herb Jones would be, especially given the salary difference between those two players as well. There is one more exception we need to talk about, and that is the disabled player exceptions. So far, the NBA has awarded 3 of these this season. All 3 of them expire on March 10th of 2025, which is a little bit after the trade deadline because these can also be used to sign a free agent. So this is not just a trade exception, although it can be used as one. It can be used to either sign a free agent or acquire a player via trade. Now, the rule with this is that these exceptions specifically can only be used to acquire players in the final year of their deal. You might say, well, what's the point of that? Well, you do get bird rights on the player if you do acquire someone in the final year of their deal. So that is something that is beneficial. Now, this year, there haven't been large disabled player exceptions. In some years past, these can get as high as like $8-9 million. This year, they are relatively small, and it's based on the percentage of the cap that the player who was injured was making. So for the Pacers, who had season-ending injuries to James Wiseman and Isaiah Jackson, they had small disabled player exception numbers return. And then Utah, who already had a couple of traded player exceptions earlier we talked about, The season-ending injury to Taylor Hendricks left them with nearly $3 million again here in a disabled player exception. So, like I said earlier, expect Utah to be a real component in the trade deadline, a team that's going to take in salary, a team that could be really beneficial operating as a third team, as a fourth team, trying to help trades get accomplished, trying to help trades get done. Utah, I could see being very, very active. Again, this trade deadline, that kind of just fits the Danny Ainge MO to begin with. I really hope you guys did enjoy today's video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe. Remember, make sure to leave your thoughts and comments down in the comment section below. And also, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for future NBA content. Thanks again, everyone, so much. And we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.